Welcome to a new instalment of the pharmaphorum podcast. In this episode, I speak with Murray Aitken, Executive Director of the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science, on the state of global medicine, access to those medicines, and usage and spending appetites across various therapeutic areas. Centering the conversation on the findings of the Institute's report, the Global Use of Medicines 2024 Outlook through 2028, Murray explains the figures, how more patients are receiving better medicines, which is a point often overlooked by payers and by manufacturers, and notes that an evolution in knowledge of human biology and disease is overhauling the science. Indeed, looking at the data, this trend is clear, though there is much more to be done, granted, but, all things considered, progress has been made, and benefits are being brought. Let us know if you share the positivity. And as ever, thank you for listening. This is web editor Nicole Rowley, and today I have with me Murray Aitken, Executive Director of the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science. Welcome, Murray.
Thank you, and great to be with you today.
So today, we'll be discussing the state of global medicines and what the future outlook is when it comes to research and development and usage and spending appetites. Indeed, according to the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science's recent report, entitled The Global Use of Medicines 2024, Outlook through 2028, global use of medicines grew by 14% over the past 5 years, and a further 12% increase is expected through 2028, that is to say the next 5 years, bringing annual use to 3.8 trillion defined daily doses. But before we really sink into the numbers and the finer details, perhaps you could provide listeners with details of your journey to today, Murray, and your role at IQVIA.
Sure, happy to take you through my life, if you wish. My life started in New Zealand. I was born and raised there, the son of a sheep farmer, as many of us are. It's been a long journey from there. I have a business background, and for the last 25 years have been focused in and around healthcare, and in particular the life sciences sector. I was with a consulting firm for many years, and then in 2001 joined what was then IMS Health, and since 2011 have headed up what is now the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science. We're a separate team that operates under our IQVIA Institute brand. We're a part of IQVIA, but we sit a little bit apart. We undertake research destined for the public domain. That research draws upon all of the IQVIA assets, the data assets we have, the expertise we have within the company. We apply those to a broad range of healthcare issues and publish the results of that research in the form of reports that, as I say, go into the public domain. They're used by a large number of stakeholders, public sector, private sector. And our goal is really to advance the conversation and understanding of what's going on in healthcare, and doing that through the lens of evidence-based research, and also looking at issues from a health system perspective rather than from the perspective of any particular individual stakeholder. Our research is well cited, both in academic circles, government policy circles, in Washington, in Brussels, in Geneva, and elsewhere. And we're very excited by the work that we do in the Institute, and the value that we think we're able to contribute to that global discussion about healthcare.
Thank you, Murray. So if we think about advancing the conversation and understanding of what's going on in healthcare, let's now kick off with discussion of overall global spending on medicines. So global spending on medicine, by using list prices, grew by 35% over the past 5 years and is forecast to increase by 38% through 2028, according to the report. And also according to the report, the growth outlook on spending looks set to reach $2.3 trillion by that 5-year 2028 date. Those are quite some figures. Can you provide further commentary and explain for listeners just what that means, Murray?
Indeed, these are large numbers. As you mentioned, the numbers you've cited are based on list prices of drugs. We understand well that that's not necessarily the amount that drug manufacturers receive. Though I do point out that in our report, when we look at the US market, we are able to look at that market on a net manufacturer realized price basis. So we include that in the report. But so we know that sort of headline number is more than the sort of the size of the market from a manufacturer perspective. However you cut it, the numbers are large. And as I point out, often it's not unreasonable that people do ask questions about what value do we get for the $1 trillion or so that is being spent, or maybe $2 trillion in a few years. And, I think this is a reflection of the value that medicines bring in terms of advancing patient outcomes, in terms of advancing population health. It's a reflection of the amount of investment that has gone in over many decades to result in the significant number of new drugs that have been launched over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and the transformations that have occurred as a result in terms of how patients are cared for across a whole range of diseases, including, let's not forget, the contribution to the COVID-19 pandemic most recently. I think it's also fair to say that the spending is not evenly distributed around the world, and we still have the sort of what you might expect to be in terms of the distribution across the more developed countries, and on a per capita basis. When you get to the low and middle income countries, the amount being spent on medicines is very low, and frankly falls woefully short of perhaps what it should be in order to address both chronic and communicable diseases that still afflict so many in that part of the world. But it is a big number. Actually, as a percentage of total healthcare spending, it's not been going up very much. And in fact, if you take a long view, it's pretty steady with where it's been over the last 10, 15 years. It does get a lot of attention certainly in policy circles, but often that attention actually outweighs its contribution to overall growth in healthcare spending. But maybe that's a topic for another time. But yes, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of value. It's a lot of drugs, and it's a very dynamic part of our health system.
Gosh, you've covered quite a few different areas there within just what that overall figure encompasses, really. And I want to tunnel down slightly. So if we turn to patient access, more patients are being treated with novel medicines with better clinical outcomes, as you touched upon, and there has been higher growth of, in particular, oncology therapies in developing regions since 2018. Meanwhile, wealthier countries have increased use of novel targeted therapies. So perhaps you could go into greater detail on both these points. I mean, access, after all, is a critical issue.
Yes. So one of the themes that really came through in this year's report as we sort of come out from the COVID-19 pandemic era is a recognition of how much of the growth in the spending on medicines is driven by a change in the mix of medicines that are being used. And when we sort of take things apart, we can see that certainly in Western Europe and in the US, it's that change in mix of drugs rather than absolute volume increases in the use of drugs. It's the mix that's driving 80% of the spending growth. It's less in other parts of the world, Asia Pacific, China, etc., where volume growth is still the main driver. But certainly in the high income countries, it's the mix that's driving the growth. And when we again drill into that, we look at areas like oncology, and as you say, we can see how the per capita use of targeted therapies has grown so significantly over the last really just 5 years. So we included an exhibit where we look at each region around the world and look at their per capita use of targeted medicines in oncology. The share that represents of total oncology treatments, ranges from less than 5% in India to 40% in Western Europe. But these are all up from the level that they were 5 years ago. A lot of that increase is driven by the PD-1s, the PD-L1 inhibitors that have been an extraordinarily powerful new approach to treating many forms of cancer that were introduced about 10 years ago now. And again, that's a specific area where we've seen the volume use of those drugs really explode in the last few years. Still much more so in the high-income countries than in middle and low-income countries. But that sort of increase in use is one of the reasons why we talk about more patients receiving better treatments. The clinical evidence around the PD-1s is very impressive, and the PD-1s have become the backbone of so many different types of cancer treatments, and patients are living longer, and using these treatments for longer as well. That's also a driver of growth. So again, when you look at the innovation that's been coming through the pipeline, frankly, less so in the last few years, with the exception of the COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics, but more in the past 5, 10, 15 years, those drugs are increasingly being used because they're better for patients. They are resulting in better outcomes. And the change in that mix of medicine is, as I say, a major driver of the overall growth in spending that we are reporting on.
Thank you. So I want to stick with therapy areas for a second, and therapy areas with greater spending. And those include immunology, as well as oncology, as we've been discussing, and also endocrinology. And there has, of course, been rapid uptake in treatments for diabetes and obesity, also predominantly in the US and other developed markets. And focusing on that for a second, what are your comments, if you may, on the obesity market, so to speak, and the incredible appetite for GLP-1s?
Yes, so clearly there's a lot going on in and around the diabetes and obesity space. We view this current generation of treatments to be transformative in terms of providing a therapeutic for patients with obesity that, by all the evidence, is leading to some very dramatic reductions in weight, and the spillover downstream consequences of that in terms of reduced cardiovascular risk and also renal risk we see most recently. This class of drugs, and it's not just GLPs, it's GIPs, GLPs, and then there's actually many other mechanisms that are being studied in the clinic currently. This does bring a very different way of thinking about weight and obesity and its impact on overall healthcare conditions. It's not that long ago that we were all hearing repeatedly that obesity would be what bankrupts health systems, that we can't afford obesity. And it's somewhat ironic that I now hear people saying we can't afford to treat obesity, which strikes me as an odd position to have suddenly switched to. And indeed, the most recent Lancet Commission on Obesity report, speaks clearly of the still the growing impact of obesity, around the world, including, importantly, in low and middle income countries as well. The good news is we seem to have come across treatments that can really reverse that trend. Again, there's still a long way to go in terms of their long-term use and other issues, but it does seem that we're on the cusp of something truly transformative. I would also point out that when we look in the pipeline, we just issued another report on R&D trends and highlighted there the 124 drugs that are in active clinical development currently for obesity. Almost half of those are oral formulations versus the self-injectable forms that are available today. 35% of those are GIP or GLP-1 glucagon receptor agonists. 65% have other mechanisms. So we have an enormous amount of activity and investment going into this area. We are going to see continued progress over the next decade or two from a scientific and clinical perspective. And then it's a matter of how are these treatments going to be accessed? How are they going to be used? Do they deliver the real world benefits that have been demonstrated so far? Will that continue? And then what will be the consequential impact of weight loss on many, many other disease areas? And indeed, the underlying mechanism for the GLPs, of course, is also being already used in other disease areas, including addiction and so on. So we've got a long journey ahead of us. It's very exciting, and we're not ones to get hyper excited early, I might add, but this one really feels like a game changer that is upon us. And we're seeing that coming through in the numbers in terms of the demand for these medicines and their uptake. Of course, there have been supply chain constraints that have prevented that full potential from being realized. But we're forecasting, very strong demand for these drugs over the next 5 years. In fact, in terms of spending on the drugs, even though we know there's going to be a large amount of active competition in this space, we're anticipating that obesity drugs may be the fourth largest therapy area by 2028. So, that's a sign also of the value that these drugs can bring, not only individuals, but also health populations, population health from that perspective as well. So definitely an area to be watching as things progress.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So now let's look at something that perhaps is going in the opposite direction. And there are lower expectations for COVID-19 vaccinations and therapeutics. And many countries are vaccinating at rates below their pre-pandemic trend. However, with a 4-year anniversary approaching on the 11th of March from when the pandemic started, Murray, what are your thoughts on this lessening focus on SARS-CoV-2? And what part does a shift in concentration towards disease X, for example, play?
So when we were updating our outlook to 2028, the biggest change in our outlook came in the area of the COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics, where we took down our forecast by a significant amount, about $150 billion over that time. And that is mostly a reflection of how 2023 played out differently than we had anticipated. And frankly, I think differently than most had anticipated, with a very sharp drop-off in the use of COVID-19 vaccines. And also, thankfully, a reduction in the demand for therapeutics, generally as well. I think, our understanding of COVID-19 specifically and the pandemic is still evolving. Sidebar, we still got a lot to learn about long COVID and what that is and what that means. And we must not let that go, because there are millions of people who are in that segment there. But it seems that, CDC in the US just recently announced, or sort of updated their guidance. I think everyone's trying to understand kind of where is this disease now, and what is the optimal way to keep it under control as it continues to evolve as a virus. I think at the same time, it's clear that there's been a sort of public pullback, if you like, in receptivity towards public health, exhortations to get vaccinated. And, there were clearly flashpoints around that, during the height of the pandemic. But, the long-term consequence of that is of great concern. And that is what I would describe as a general pullback in public receptivity to vaccines of all types. We have seen this show up in the numbers. It's most acute in lower income countries. More vulnerable countries have had their overall vaccination rates drop off, sort of markedly from the height of the pandemic. But even in high income countries, after that peak that we saw in 2021, we're well down off of that. And that's, again, not just about COVID-19 vaccines. It's about flu vaccines. It's about RSV vaccines now that are available. It's about shingles and so on. Particularly in the adult vaccination space, we're on the wrong track. And the collective in health systems really have to redouble efforts to get things back on track. That should be easier the further we get away from the height of the pandemic. But this is an issue that we should not lose focus on, because we know that vaccines work. We know that they're a cost-effective part of the health system, and we can't afford to have measles breaking out across developed countries. And the good news is we've got new types of vaccines, in particular the RSV vaccines that are now available, that are coming out of the pipeline, but their uptake is less than optimal, shall we say?
No, exactly. Well stated on the vaccine fatigue that seems to be taking place. We'll leave measles because that could be a different podcast entirely. So now let's turn to something else that you have sort of dotted around the conversation today, Murray, and that's LMICs, or low and middle income countries. If we think about those developing markets and spending by geographic regions, as the report shows, it's estimated that there will be faster growth in Latin America and Asia than other regions over the next 5 years. And I was wondering if you could provide comment on that and perhaps provide examples.
Yes. So I think one of the things we track, again, is this metric, defined daily dose. So we've converted every medicine into a defined daily dose. WHO does a lot of that. We've added a lot of additional analytics to have a total view of it. And so that enables us to look, again, at the total consumption in a country, in every country, of medicines. And there we see the most rapid growth coming through in Latin America and Asia Pacific over the last 5 years and for the next 5 years ahead. A lot of that is driven by demographics. Population growth is high in those countries, unlike some of the developed countries, which now have declining total populations. So populations are young and growing. Access is increasing. Availability of medicines is increasing. It's far from perfect. The access issue is not solved. That's for sure, even for essential medicines that by definition should be available to everyone in a population. We know that the use of those medicines is far from ideal, but we are seeing the higher rate there. That being said, the absolute level of medicine use, say in Latin America, comes in last year at about 700 defined daily doses per capita. That compares to over 1,000 per capita in Western Europe or Japan. In Asia Pacific, excluding China, Japan, and Korea, that number's about 300. So, again, we're still there. We're still at 30% of where we are in Western Europe and Japan. And, that's a measure of the distance we have yet to go to bring, quote, equal access around the world to medicines. The gap is slowly closing, but, based on the trajectories that we see, we've got still many decades ahead of us before we see a closing of the gap. And by the way, this is not necessarily a gap about expensive medicines. This is also very much a gap in very low-cost generics that are safe and effective and available, but don't reach all the patients who would potentially benefit from them.
Okay. Thank you for that. Sorry, I say okay there because I was wondering if you wanted to expand on your last point.
No, that was it.
Okay. So if we do think of sort of closing remarks now, I mean, from the conversation, you mentioned this sort of this trio of concepts of a lot of money, a lot of value, a lot of drugs earlier today. But essentially, it's a lot of patient benefit too. So if you were to provide a succinct summary of what the IQVIA report has shown, how would you phrase that as a takeaway for our listeners?
So I would phrase it as more patients are receiving better medicines. This is a narrative that often gets overlooked in the day-to-day efforts by payers to limit growth in the amount they're spending in their drug budgets. It's overlooked by manufacturers who spend more time pointing out the limitations in access than the success in patients accessing medicines. I think it's also, we also overlook just how much evolution there has been in the science and the knowledge of human biology, of disease, and of the treatments that can help address those diseases. So, one of the things, again, when we sort of reflected on all the data that we had to work with in pulling together this report, the thing that kept coming back to us is if we look at the data, we are seeing that more patients are receiving better medicines. This is a good news story. Nothing is perfect and far from it, much more to be done. But compared to where we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or longer, let's acknowledge the progress that has been made and the benefits that brings to individual patients as well as health systems overall.
A good news story indeed. Thank you very much, Murray. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you. Great to be with you.
And so that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find out more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments of the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podbean, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Twitter, or X nowadays, at @pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.